Hello, everyone. Ian Hamilton with Good Virtual Reality here, and thanks for giving us your time today. In case you're new here, you can become a subscriber at goodvirtualreality.com. Many episodes of this podcast head out over email first to paid subscribers before publishing everywhere. Thank you to my founding members, paid subscribers, sponsors, and the donations I've received supporting the production of this independent journalism directly. Today, I'm joined by Shane Harris, the creator of SideQuest, as well as a new attempt that we're going to talk about today to revive AltSpace. So, Shane, where are you tuning in from today? And why don't you say hi to everyone there?
Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. Today I'm coming to you all the way from Dubai in the Middle East.
Wow, this is quite a distance for this call then today. I guess I'll just get started right here at the top of this, asking the two questions I ask pretty much all my guests. That first question here is, how did you get into VR in the first place?
Interesting. How did I get into VR? Well, for me, it started around, 2014, 15, 16 was when I really got into VR. At the time, I was the CTO of a small tech company in Northern Ireland, and we did emotions analytics for market research purposes mainly, which sounds a bit crazy, but basically we did a lot of pseudoscience trying to prove to brands that, through sensors and other things that their campaigns were effective. And VR was part of that. It was one of the tools and utilities that we used to try and verify that. And yeah, I remember we were set up in CES and we had a stall. I had created a little virtual reality experience on the DK1, and it was aggregating tweets from the conference into like this visualization experience. And I remember at the time I was very proud because a bunch of the guys from the Oculus team came over to our booth and tried out the demo.
Interesting. And then before I get to the question of your favorite moment of presence, why don't you tell me how SideQuest came together?
Well, SideQuest is quite an interesting one. And honestly, there's an origin here that sort of ties into AltSpace as well. So I think it's probably worth mentioning that. I started out building tools in those very early days of VR, tools that let people create worlds, right? That was kind of where I started. And I started on AltSpace doing that. I created a world builder, a little interface that allowed you to create inside of VR. Very popular. And a lot of their own tools were inspired by it. But at some point, they decided they were going to change direction in terms of how their SDKs worked, which were important for my suite of tools, let's say. And my tools basically weren't going to continue to work anymore. That was the first barrier I came up against. And my response to it, instead of giving up, was to try and build my own platform and spin my tools out into that platform. That's what I tried to do all that long time ago. Very ambitious, nowhere near enough experience to try and do something like that. At the same time, Facebook, as they were known back then, they had basically just announced the curation policy on Quest. So I submitted that platform, that app, for consideration. We were probably one of the first ones to get rejected. So I'm sure you know where this is going. But after that, yeah, we decided once again, barrier number 2, instead of giving up, I built SideQuest originally as a tool to help us distribute that app. But overnight, it exploded into the marketplace that we know it as today. And now here we are, nearly 7 years later, millions of users, millions of dollars of investment, and we're still out there fighting to give users and developers a place to share content in VR.
Yeah, so I believe you've taken money from Palmer Luckey as well as I think Google Ventures. Is that right? Both very strategic partners there. How is SideQuest doing these days, and how have you weathered the changing policies? You filled a gap in the market that was made there by Meta, but Meta has done, 6 shifts in strategy since they've abandoned the curation to just open up the store, and they've got their MetaQuest Plus subscription catalog. And one of my guests on the podcast described that as the only curated space still in the Meta ecosystem. That was a eye-opening way to frame it, to realize got to be in that subscription program to have any hope of making regular money out of the system. And so, just recap for me sort of the last 5 years or so of sort of just trying to roll with the punches.
I'll say one thing for sure. I don't think it matters who you are in this industry. It can be really difficult to predict what Meta is going to do next. In some cases, I'm really not too sure if they know exactly what they're going to do next. What we do know is that they've done a lot of good for the industry. They've paid forward a considerable amount, probably close to $80 billion so far. But yeah, I mean, in terms of how we've worked with the ecosystem, I remember in the earliest days when SideQuest started, that first year, 2019, trying to get in touch with Chris Pruitt to try to position us to try and negotiate a better situation for developers to be able to gain access to the platform and find ways to leverage SideQuest to do that. We actually developed a relationship, and in the coming years, we were working behind the scenes, helping them test out the system that became known as AppLab before it went live. And it somewhat represented a culmination of our efforts to try and secure access to store features and properties that developers just couldn't access on SideQuest. AppLab launched. It was a whole breath of air for a number of developers to be admitted into that new system, to get access to all the benefits that come with being on the platform, on the store, having access to payment systems and user systems, other platform features. The important thing is to kind of recognize what SideQuest has been in all of that role. What's really interesting is that when they started with the Quest, they had a pitch process. When AppLab launched, that pitch process kind of disappeared. They were given access to an unlisted store listing through AppLab, and they had to prove that their app was good and then almost be headhunted by Meta to be able to get more access and exposure. And what naturally happened is that SideQuest became that testing ground for everybody. Meta basically used SideQuest as a means for them to kind of handpick the games that they wanted to migrate or graduate from AppLab into the main store. Things have been crazy for the last 2.5 years, and Meta has gone through a lot of shifting priorities. Around 2 years ago now, they really ramped up their efforts on their own metaverse offering, which was Horizon Worlds. And at the time, they kind of went from a position of promoting third-party developers and games into promoting their own Horizon Worlds content. That escalated quite a lot. The reason for that was because they were seeing platforms like VR Chat and seeing games like Gorilla Tag that heavily depended on that social aspect of their audience and how effective that was for them, especially in areas like retention and engagement. I don't think any other store category really hit the mark as much as they did. It was clear that was the motivation behind Horizon Worlds, behind their entire metaverse effort, or even the renaming of the company to Meta, for that matter, was that they wanted a slice of that and to be able to have that for themselves. We moved from a world where Meta would regularly announce how successful third-party developers were doing on their platform into a world where it was mostly around them promoting their own content on Horizon Worlds. And honestly, that represented a really dark time for a lot of third-party developers because their only outlet of native store discovery was being eroded very, very quickly. It was around the same time that they announced Horizon OS and that they were opening the store for everybody. But actually, how it turned out was less about improved discovery and accessibility for developers and more about their effort to reprioritize things for Horizon Worlds. That went on for about 18 months. And while that was happening, a number of developers basically experienced, I guess, what they would have described as a nosedive in sales. We've had a few casualties now over the last 18 months of certain developers that have disappeared or have been removed from the store, or massive titles that have decided to shut down as a result of that. Once again, we were kind of in a position where SideQuest was still an invaluable piece of the ecosystem because we still consistently provided that discovery, the community, and the promotion that developers ultimately needed. We're still here today doing that same thing. I'll just sum it up with the last 6 months has also been about us expanding beyond just the Meta platform And now, SideQuest encompasses kind of an all-in-one, one-stop shop, if you will, of all VR content that's out there and available. Everything is now listed on SideQuest. Titles you'll find on Steam, titles you'll find on Meta, and of course, exclusive content that's only on SideQuest. It's all in one place. We're pretty excited about the Steam frame. I think a lot of people out there are. Hopefully, the distribution problems in consumer hardware won't affect the price too much, and it'll be in a place where it's accessible for consumers. And yeah, it might become the new staple of the industry. That's my hope.
If you had to single out one moment of presence in VR as your favorite, what would it be?
I've been thinking about this since you mentioned it there, but my one actually goes right back to the very start, right back to 2016. Is probably a DK2 experience, in fact. The first game I spent any decent amount of time in was Grand Theft Auto 5. Now, as we know, that was never released, but there's always been mods. Mods has always been kind of a core part of VR, and actually more so today than ever before. But yeah, I used a mod to be able to use GTA 5, and I racked up maybe 300 hours as my first game that I put a serious amount of time into. And to answer your question, the presence moment there, I have an almost crippling fear of heights. I used to really enjoy climbing up onto a crane, hanging out off the edge, swinging my way out to the very extent of the crane, and just enjoying the view from there. Another one that I also enjoyed was the helicopter flight, just flying over a pretty dense part of the city, and then banking pretty hard, looking to my left out the window at the buildings below me, all flying past. Now, there's been a few mods of GTA 5. I'm sure we all know about the name Luke Ross, right? He's done some stuff there, and he's been in the media somewhat in recent months, but nothing really compares to what it was back in those days. For me, it hasn't been as good since, and maybe I'm just romanticizing it, because how can you say a DK2 is better than what you can get today? It was the software that made it great. That was my most enjoyable moment of presence.
I love that story. Grand Theft Auto is like the pinnacle of gaming. They spend a decade building each one of those games, and generational games. People take a week off of work to really enjoy it when it comes out. And when they delay the game and move it to a new date 6 months later, it's a breath of fresh air for all the other devs that can now actually survive in that period, right? Takes all the time out of everyone's day. The number of hours I've just spent just driving around those cities and building stars, getting the cops mad at me is just tremendous. The idea of adapting it to VR is not an easy task. Look at things like, let's look at these examples. Pistol whip, where they keep you in a straight line at a constant rate of speed. So it's a little uncomfortable, but generally very comfortable because of those design choices. And then you look at things like Beat Saber and Space Pirate Trainer and the Brookhaven experiment. And you're going back to the early days of VR in some of those things. Space Pirate Trainer, you never move off of your spot. And I go back to 2016, and I remember these parties I would have where I had like people over to show off my VR headset, and everyone can take a turn in Space Pirate Trainer or Brookhaven experiment. And each person, it's like, do you get scared easy? Okay, let's not put you in Brookhaven experiment. Let's put you in Space Pirate Trainer. Or if you do like getting scared, if you like horror movies, let's put you in Brookhaven experiment and let you scream when the zombie's really getting close to you. You take Space Pirate Trainer, Brookhaven, and Beat Saber, and very close to 100% will feel comfortable in those experiences, assuming it's running at 90 frames per second because the hardware is actually providing enough oomph for that to run. The Space Pirate Trainer, they did a lot of optimization to get that to run even on integrated graphics cards on Windows.
Yeah.
Those things come out, and then almost immediately the market responds with like, this isn't enough. I'm tired of wave shooters. We need more than this. I want my full gaming experiences. And to your point on like Grand Theft Auto, you're out there using the mods, the early day mods, and going crazy with it. Do you experience simulator sickness? What's that like for you?
I used to back in the day. Occasionally it'll happen. but very, very rarely. I mean, it's like most things, you kind of get used to it. But it is a huge deal and it is a huge problem for people. There's design choices that can be made to try and negate that. 50% of people in VR suffer from that problem. A bunch of the people on my team who are heavily involved in the development of VR experiences have to have all of the extra measures in place or they suffer from it still. But no, I'm actually not too bad now. I can usually be flipped upside down and spun around without too much trouble.
There's giving gamers what they want, the people who say, I can handle this and just give it to me. I want Grand Theft Auto make me sick by letting me do everything. And then there's building for the people that can't handle it and might experience VR for the first time and want to try something like Grand Theft Auto out. You can build experiences that are sort of cut down in a way that doesn't make them very interesting. The thing that would make it comfortable for me would be having it be a driving simulator 95% of the time.
Yes.
And I'm just driving around in the driver's seat of a vehicle. And the moment that I hit the triangle button to step out of the vehicle, I get a flat screen pop up in front of me. Imagine your Tesla touchscreen shows the flat screen exit from the car. You're now controlling your character with thumbstick down on that screen while still sitting in the driver's seat of the car. And then the moment
Yes.
you get back into another vehicle, it teleports you to the new vehicle and you're driving around again in the new vehicle. That would be comfortable for me, right? Like I could play
Yes.
that version of Grand Theft Auto for hours and not get sick. If you rolled that out, there would be a non-zero number of the audience that would be like, this is embarrassing. There are plenty of people that are going to be wanting smooth locomotion for that moment of running around on the streets just on foot. And
Yeah.
how do you satisfy both those audiences? The people like me that need the super comfort and the other people that are just like, give me it all and let me get crazy with it. It's an unsolved problem. And I think there's people out there like Tim Sweeney at Epic Games who has gone on the record to suggest that VR games will never reach the scale of flat screen games because of this comfort issue, because of
Yes.
you never being able to move around the way that you can in a game like Fortnite in VR. Obviously, a major issue that's still going to be with us for a long time. And yet, there's things like H3 VR 2. So, Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades 2 that's being developed. I am more excited for H3 VR 2 than I ever was for Deadpool, Asgard's Wrath 2, Batman Arkham Shadow. This is a game that has teleport, has smooth locomotion, and it was built from the ground up by people who have already made a VR game that didn't just make a VR game, they eked out an existence for the last decade building a VR game explicitly for VR on minimum spec systems, kept talking to their audience week after week after week to give them what they want. And now they're getting to do a fully fledged sequel with the support of Meta helping fund it and bring together some of the best VR developers in the world. Mark Schramm, who worked on Superhot and a couple other experiences out there, is one of the engineers building this project. And the crazy thing about it is it's going to be like, you have to imagine it being a fraction of the budget that they threw at those other games that I mentioned, the tentpole end-of-year games like Arkham Shadow and Asgard's Wrath 2. This is an independent team that's pulled together some of the best developers in the world, and it's still a fraction of the amount of money that it kind of costs to ship those other games and promote them. The ground floor of VR development is in a new place. I'm hopeful that that game sees incredible success and actually convinces people to go out and buy headsets. If that finds success on the Meta platform or Steam, and it's this small sort of like focused thing, I hope a lot of people can look at it and go, huh, well, maybe I should make a VR headset. Maybe now is the time for Nintendo to make its console and port a game like H3 VR 2 to it. And maybe Sony can actually make a standalone VR headset that's lightweight and runs Android XR. I am jumping around a tremendous amount here, but I'm trying to paint a picture here of the twists and turns that are very hard for regular viewers or like drop-in people to see what has happened in this industry. You talked about Meta's Horizon OS in the middle of all this, and they had prepared Horizon OS to run on a series of headsets that never popped up. And it's unclear why they didn't pop up. Like, no one's going to come out and say exactly why that is, but it's kind of insane to imagine trying to compete with Meta inside of their own ecosystem while Meta's making its own headsets, and also having to follow Meta's rules while they're changing the rules around you all the time. Meanwhile, Google comes around with its own Android XR operating system and offers different terms of building with it. Meta was preparing itself to shotgun Horizon OS out onto many different headsets. And when that didn't happen, they had to pick a different strategy. And I think that's the period that we're in right now, is them having to come to grips with a different strategy than they sort of built themselves for. They don't have a whole bunch of partners out there building Horizon OS headsets. Google has returned to reap the rewards of Meta building a robust Android-based VR ecosystem. Steam is out there to reap the rewards of Meta proving out standalone VR. Apple is out here to try to reap the rewards of the same ideas of, like, let's adapt iPad OS to VR and get into this with two different headsets between 2024 and last year when they did the spec bump. And all of this is to say, like, I feel like we're at the cusp of a new dawn in the VR industry when people have really figured out what makes a comfortable experience, how to appeal to both these audiences, the people that have never tried VR before and need sort of kid gloves, people who have tried VR like crazy and still need the kid gloves because it's so uncomfortable to them. And then these hardcore gamers that are like, just rip them off and let me do whatever I want and install every mod I want to my standalone headset. I had to say all of this sort of in response to your Grand Theft Auto thing, because like those things have been around for a really long time, those sort of mods to let people do what they want. But it
Yes.
faces the reality of the VR market and these comfort issues that are still unsolved
Yes.
here in 2026.
I'll tell you something. I agree with you. I think we are on the cusp of a new dawn. And let me tell you why. There's been two major waves of adoption in VR so far, right? 2016 was the first one with, the HTC Vive and the Rift CV1. That was when everything kind of ripped off. And investment was huge, massive bubble. Then things kind of quietened down for a little bit. 2019, we started on the uphill climb of the next wave of adoption, which kind of culminated in the end of 2021, start of 2022, just after Quest 2. There was a massive number of units sold. I believe they sold more Quest 2s in that 12-month period than Microsoft sold Xboxes, right? That was the peak of that wave of adoption. And things have cooled since then. I think that the Steam frame could represent the next wave of adoption. And I think the theme of that wave of adoption could be that for the first time, we start to mix traditional gaming and VR. Because until now, traditional gaming and VR have been completely separated. And it was interesting to hear you describe that transition that you thought would be ideal in Grand Theft Auto, because kind of what you're talking about there is going from a fully immersive experience to more of an external, like traditional gaming experience, the Tesla screen in the car that you would continue to play on. And I think that for the first time with Steam Frame, we're actually going to see an ecosystem that supports that as a model. Like Sony tried to do it with PSVR 2. They tried to encourage titles to build for both and to have transitions to go from one to the other. But Steam is going to actively promote the use of their existing traditional content library, much like you do on a Steam Deck. The Steam Frame will play all of that stuff as well. And what I think is really interesting about it as a platform is that obviously it's going to be a lot more open. And that's not something that's, I think, based on, hopium, especially not the sort of hopium that you see across the various Steam Frame subreddits. Valve has already demonstrated by putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and investing huge amounts into open source software, especially around emulation layers that will make it possible to play PC games on this headset, but also play Android games. And both of those categories will be in and out of virtual reality. And I actually think it's not a terrible scenario here that, you're in your car, you're driving around. Motion sickness is not as big of an issue because you've got that cockpit factor. You've got that visual cue for your brain to attach to prevent you from feeling like you're moving when you're not. And then when you want, you can transition away from that. Like, I think it's really interesting that when GTA 5 launched, one of the biggest things about it was that it had, for the first time, first person view. And this wasn't limited to, people in our space in VR, of course, but everybody thought that this was an amazing, immersive enhancement to the game, that your player would remain in first person view. There was no cutscenes, there was no animations. If he did a tumble or whatever, you got to experience all of that from the perspective of his eyes. And at the time, I remember thinking how amazing that was as a way to bridge the gap between that enormous open world experience and virtual reality, where you can become fully immersed in it. It just made sense. I endured those tumbles in VR in the earliest days, as uncomfortable as they may have felt. I preferred it that way. But I think your way of doing things right now is actually probably where the industry needs to go and should be going. This transition from traditional content into immersive content, I feel like, is actually the next generation of what we should be doing. Like, that first wave of adoption, I feel like that was driven by early users, enthusiasts, that kind of thing, people who are willing to endure the rough edges because they were so excited about the tech. I think that second wave has probably been driven by a more mainstream and actually younger audience on Quest 2, who are less susceptible in some senses, but also they stick to a certain specific type of experience. But that division has always been there, whether it's PC VR last decade or it's standalone VR this decade. It's been VR almost entirely, without really much in the way of 2D gaming being promoted or made accessible. And by 2D, I mean, pancake game, traditional gaming. And actually, I think now we're going to transition into a phase where people are less excited about the tech and don't feel the need to spend so much time moving around and on their feet, because most traditional gamers don't do that, right? There's actually not much activity in a player who plays traditional gaming. This is something, of course, in esports as well, that most of the players, they actually don't move that much, really, when they're playing the game. And it's something that I think VR needs to accommodate. So having a headset that would let you seamlessly transition to a kind of a relaxed position on the sofa, play the game in 2D, and then go immersive when you feel like you've got the energy to, I think that could be a catalyst to this next wave of adoption, which is us breaking out into that traditional gaming market and being able to accommodate that transition of people becoming basically less active in VR. And as a result of being less active, less motion sick in VR as well, right? Because if you're feeling a bit unwell, okay, I'll just seamlessly swap into traditional mode. And what I've seen with the current state of investment in VR, and I say that as we have, multiple millions of dollars that we put forward to invest in games. And so far this year, I've signed one game, finalizing another two. The priority and the focus there overall is about creating games that can work as traditional games as much as they can as VR games. And that's what I think this new dawn is. That's what I think this next wave of adoption will be. It'll be that transition between VR and non-VR, and how easily a single device can provide an experience. And the software is the key part, right? Maybe there's other halfway houses as well. Like, I like your idea of you're in the car, but then the perspective changes. Maybe the first person stuff wasn't as cool as we thought all the way back then in Grand Theft Auto. And maybe it should turn into something like Moss, right? Or Trover Saves the Universe, where you're actually playing from a third person perspective and you're kind of looking down on what's going on. You've still got all the wealth of immersion there, but you're not seeing it from that person's eyes. And therefore, you can have a much more detached position from all of the action and the motion. And therefore, you can probably feel more comfortable. But I think the solution really is that, and this isn't something that's new by any means, right? But giving people the advanced options to go crazy when they want to, but providing those safe defaults is probably a good place to start. And letting people calm down and bow out when they want to, without having to leave the experience. That's going to be a way to tackle that.
I agree with a lot of that. I spent a lot of time in Apple Vision Pro, and they've got their home experiences, and there's zero artificial locomotion in there, and you can bring up endless windows around you, and there could be a 3D movie over to your left and a 2D game over to your right and an actual volumetric game out in front of you of like chess, and you have to like lean forward actually to move a piece, or you can lean back and just do it with the eye pinch. And it's been a long time coming. I think the realization in my mind is that VR headsets are going to take quite a bit more work in order to return back to the $500 price point. I think that's the hard lesson here, is that it needs to be a personal computer on your face. It needs to have all the utility of a personal computer. And once it has all the utility of a personal computer, then you can start layering back in VR games and other things. Apple Vision Pro isn't there yet, right? You can't run all of your Mac apps on the Vision Pro alone. You have to still bring up Mac Virtual Display for a lot of things. And Android XR is almost there. Let's switch topics and let's talk about AltSpace a little bit here. For those who aren't sort of aware, Rec Room died earlier this year. That was an independent startup against gravity that raised quite a lot of money. And you can listen to my episode with Sean Whiting to hear what happened there, of them just sort of bloating up with investment money and buying into this idea of trying to be the VR social network in competition with Meta. And obviously the sort of money ran out a little bit there and they had to shut down. They kind of didn't see the path there that they could really pull off an independent thing. And it was sort of heartbreaking to talk with Sean Whiting a little bit about like, well, could you have operated it in perpetuity by being a smaller entity and not hiring so many hundreds of people? And they're like, yeah, but that wasn't what we were offering investors. That wasn't the thesis that was given to the investors. And then there's AltSpace. So AltSpace was in this same category. So just a few years younger or a few years older, depending how you look at it. AltSpace basically had to exit earlier. And there was this whole backstory there where it was going to shut down. And right during the period of it shutting down, it got rescued by Microsoft. So Microsoft showed up and hired some of the remaining people who were still there, ported the URL over to Microsoft services, and it became one of the last foundational layers of the Windows mixed reality ecosystem before it died inside of Microsoft. So several years go by and Microsoft decides to shut down AltSpace. So you've got AltSpace, you've got Rec Room that have little headstones in their names, and we remember them fondly, and broke a lot of hearts because many people found connection in these spaces. They have some of their best memories in those spaces. And actually, the intro and outro of this podcast is audio pulled from Rec Room. So thank you to one of the co-founders of Rec Room for giving me permission to use that audio for the intro and outro there. Let's understand here exactly how you got this idea to revive AltSpace, and mechanically, have you talked to Microsoft about it, and how are you making this happen?
There's a lot there, really, isn't there? You've mentioned a bunch of platforms, but there's actually a few more. Spatial is another casualty. Multiverses is another one. There's quite a few. Neos VR, but that's kind of for different reasons, right? There was specific things going on in that community that led it to shut down. And of course, it has the evolution of Resonite, which is the next generation of that community.
And you've got Banter as well. You've done the Banter effort. So explain what Banter is relative to AltSpace as well.
Banter has always been a little bit more crazy, I guess, right? Than AltSpace would have been. A little bit more free and edgy, and you can do whatever you kind of want. It's probably closer to VR chat in that kind of regard. But AltSpace was different. AltSpace was kind of like a safe space. It was a place where people and organizations, groups, even brands could associate with it because they were a lot more careful about how they presented it, how the avatars were presented, how the worlds, how their policies and how they worked with the community was always different in there. It was more adult, but not in an adult sense where anything untoward would be kind of going on. In contrast to, say, Rec Room or Gorilla Tag or even VR Chat, AltSpace always tried to kind of cater to that older audience, that more mature audience. The last few days have been really exciting because I was aware of how much of an impact AltSpace had. They existed for nearly a decade, so it's hard to not. At some point or another, I'd say every single person in VR experienced AltSpace and got a taste of what it was about. So that brand recognition is extremely strong. I've honestly been humbled in the last few days to see the response to people. We put out kind of a soft announcement that we were going to revive the platform. We didn't explain much other than, we managed to acquire the rights to the name, the trademark. What happened there was that Microsoft abandoned it or potentially cancelled it after they sunset the platform in 2023. So yeah, we managed to stumble onto the rights of it. And what's really interesting there is it's like I was saying before about the origin story behind SideQuest. In some ways, my entire journey to date over the last decade has been driven by, by what happened in AltSpace all that long time ago. And now I have the opportunity to come full circle on that, right? And, one thing I've heard, surprisingly, a few people have said it. I would have thought more people would have said something along the lines of platforms are collapsing, hand over foot, left, right, and center right now. What makes me think that the same won't happen here and that people might have to suffer, a third withdrawal of AltSpace from public consumption. And I guess what inspires me about this exact moment is that 6 months ago, there was a number of platforms that were filling that gap that AltSpace did, right? Horizon Worlds, Rec Room, Spatial, they all kind of had that somewhat similar safe aesthetic. Even if some of them were, geared more towards a juvenile audience, they still had a reasonably well polished and safe aesthetic. But now that's all gone. So now I kind of see it that there's a gap in the space for people who want that. And one thing that you hear a lot is, why would you bother? VR chat is out there and they've got, absolute enormous concurrent user numbers that you can't really compete with that. And I agree. VR chat, for what it does, is amazing, astonishing, in fact. And I've spent plenty of time on VR chat. I really appreciate what it is for what it is. But it's also fairly narrow in terms of the audience that it targets. And there's only very specific things that you can kind of use it for. And you can try to discover maybe some smaller pockets of communities in there that do different things, but you really have to find yourself wading through the public interface in order to get close to a lot of that stuff. So yeah, I definitely think that there is space out there for people who want something that's just a little bit safer and isn't as focused on being, a showcase of avatars, let's say, and actually has a lot more focus on the community side of things, because that was always the kind of main thing about AltSpace. Was the forefront of their focus was how can they engage with the community. So that's what I want to try and revive. That's what I'm excited to try to rebuild and try and recapture, that kind of community chill vibe that you have where you can come and talk to people, and it's mostly about that connection with other people. I mean, that's what I've observed between the majority of people I see who are excited about AltSpace and the potential for its return. Like in the last couple of days, we're not talking huge numbers, but since the soft launch, we've seen 600 people flood into a Discord server. And, for any game that's trying to get itself off the ground, especially in VR, that's a really encouraging signal that this is potentially something. Last night, we did a live stream of, sharing some of the early design concepts for some built-in avatars and avatar systems that we were going to do. And I commissioned the original designer who worked on the robot avatars for AltSpace like 12 years ago to come in and help us design them. So Christian and myself did a 3-hour-long stream on that Discord server last night, and we had consistently high numbers of audience members on the stage on Discord for the whole 3 hours. It's kind of addictive, the buzz that you get from a large group of people who are all really excited and focused on that one thing of trying to recapture what that is. And I'm firmly within that community. I'm firmly within that mindset myself. So I'm just as excited as them. I think it's a really great place to be when you're trying to take a step into what is, the third wave of AltSpace, in effect. What's going to be, the next new dawn of AltSpace, just to refer back to some of the things we've been talking about. And it's interesting to see how that's probably coincided with the waves of adoption in VR as well.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. I think we're getting near the end of the podcast here. You talked about like, why shouldn't we be worried about this shutting down again for a third time? And that's a devastating thing to think about. But I got to kind of put you on the spot of like, when you build this, can you architect it peer to peer and have people actually be able to download their assets? I mean, that was the madness of Rec Room. When AltSpace shut down over at Microsoft, they did allow you to download some of the assets, but it wasn't in a way that would easily let you like build it up on your own server and invite people back to your space again. Is there any kind of thinking about like some peer-to-peer oriented policies in here in the buildup of the space?
It's definitely something that we would like to be able to promote, right? It's not nice to talk about it, certainly not at this early stage, but the longevity of what we're building beyond us. And it is something we've thought about. We are building services behind the scenes to power this new AltSpace that will also be services that we offer out generally to other developers, like live networking, voice and data services, other parts of the platform we've built, browser integrations, we've got creation tools and SDKs, we've got character systems and avatar systems. And actually what we've done is to build all of these out as modular pieces so that we can make those available to other developers as well. The hope is that serves two purposes, right? Everything you've got is kind of available on the market for you to take and potentially rebuild the platform yourself later if you want to. But also it gives us a nice way to be able to generate revenue from some of the things that we're building. Like for instance, for the last 2.5 years, we have had somebody who joined us after they worked at Ubisoft and built out the character control system for Assassin's Creed Nexus. They came and joined us and helped us build out a character control system, which we've been prototyping in Banter for the last 2.5 years. And it is state of the art. It is something that allows you to incorporate a lot of important advancements in VR that really aren't available from any of the rest of the off-the-shelf solutions. So that's something that we've built from day one as a modular piece that we can break out and make available to other people. So yeah, in a nutshell, behind the scenes, we're building this like a mix and match set of modular pieces that come together to form AltSpace. And that means that all of these pieces have their own leg to stand on in terms of forming the basis of products that we can use to sell to other studios and developers, and that we can also use to help us build out other adjacent enterprise products, because that's also a new area that we've been expanding into. So it's going to take some time to build this up and get it to the critical mass that the platform itself can generate enough revenue to be able to pay for itself. And in the meantime, we're working on ways to find other sources of revenue that can help us to sustain that. And honestly, I feel like that is one of the reasons why, the predecessors didn't do so well, is because they focused on user growth. And when that wasn't there, they had nothing really else to fall back on. We think it's going to take some time to get there, and we want to try and find a way to make it sustainable before that. But to your point, that means that whatever way this unfolds, all of the pieces will be made available to the wider community regardless.
Got it. The key thing that was in what you mentioned was less avatar focused, and I found that really interesting. I'm very curious to see how that pops out. Made me immediately think of the Museum of Other Realities, which had basically simple geometric shapes as your avatars, and you could see them like grow bigger or smaller based on the person who's talking, so you could know who's gesturing. The reason there was that they wanted to devote as much resources of every system that it ran on as possible to the artworks that they were displaying, so that they could give a minimum spec for all these artworks to kind of go crazy on these PCs and try to get them to run on as many PCs as possible without having these crazy avatars. And of course, yeah, like you mentioned, VR chat has sort of let everyone go crazy with their avatars. And there's some hard limits on how many people you can put into an instance based on letting avatars go crazy like that. And it's created a lot of headaches, quite literally, for people that have had to deal with avatars that are rekind, and then you've got fallbacks to like lower quality avatars. And there's maybe people that look at the lower quality avatars and they become almost cliquey, judgmental a little bit about the quality of the avatars. And It's really interesting to think about a space that is not oriented around that. It's more oriented around what you can do in that space or the environments you visit. So very interested to see how this rolls out with AltSpace over time. And is there anything else you want to say before we close out here about your work and what you're doing, Shane?
No, I mean, other than thank you so much, Ian, for having me on here. It's great to see what you're doing. I'm super excited about this. And as always, I'm super excited about the future of VR.
Thank you for the time. That's Shane Harris at SideQuest and now trying to bring back AltSpace. And we'll check that out and see how it develops in the future. We'll talk to you in the future.